Hey y'all, Scott here. Woo! Sorry about that. It's just, we're talking wars today. And I know what you're thinking, so I'll stop you right there. No, we're not talking about the Lebanese Civil War or the Yom Kippur War. We're talking console wars. A new console for self-proclaimed wusses launched recently, and many have discussed where it may fit within the current console race. But before we delve into that discussion, let's talk about console races of generations past. The first generation of cartridge-based console wars was a crowded one. There were a handful of competitors in the market ranging from the Odyssey 2 to the Vectrex, but the main three most will remember was the Atari 2600, Intellivision, and the ColecoVision. The Atari 2600 reigned supreme mainly due to the big-name games that appeared on it. Atari garnered most of the top arcade games on the console with hits like Space Invaders, Pong, Missile Command, Centipede, Asteroids, and Pac-Man. These titles weren't the best versions of said games, but they were close enough to make the Atari 2600 a better buy for most consumers. The Intellivision sold decently, selling around 3 million units, but didn't have as many big-name games on it as the 2600. Mattel positioned the Intellivision as a console for the more mature audiences, focusing on more complicated controls and sports games. Mattel pushed hardware more than software with multiple peripherals and console revisions, so it failed to really pose much of a threat to Atari and faded away once the video game crash of 1983 came along. The ColecoVision's game library consisted of a lot of the hidden gem arcade games that weren't on the 2600, and they even got the license to make and pack in Donkey Kong with the console. However, it came out too close to the video game crash of 1983, thus it didn't have enough time to put much of a dent in Atari's install base or garner much of a market of its own, selling around 2 million units. Nintendo came to the burning building known as the video game industry in America and put it out with a little thing called the Nintendo Entertainment System. The main competitors it had during this generation were the Atari 7800 and the Sega Master System. The Atari 7800 flopped pretty hard in comparison to the NES for a couple of reasons. The power of the system was years behind, as it was originally stated to release in 1984, but was shelved due to the disinterest in video games at the time. Also, the games on the platform were mainly in line with the titles released on the Atari 2600, with the majority being arcade games. Doesn't look as good when you're being compared to massive games at the time, such as The Legend of Zelda or Super Mario Bros. The Sega Master System was a great success in European territories, and especially Brazil. However, outside of Europe and Brazil, the Master System failed to achieve an audience. Marketing was pretty poor, and the game library just didn't hold a candle to the NES's. This was due to a lack of third parties on the Master System, as Nintendo basically held a monopoly on the video game industry, forcing third parties to contractually obligate to only make games for Nintendo platforms. With this, Nintendo was basically unstoppable this generation, with Atari and Sega together not even selling half of the NES's 61 million units sold. One of the most infamous console wars to ever transpire was the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo. Sega developed the Genesis as a competitor with the original NES, releasing in 1989. Sega mainly focused on more hardcore mature titles, such as sports games and arcade quality ports. Sega's marketing tagline was "Sega does what Nintendo don't," and they hammered in how Nintendo was for little kids and Sega was for the older ones. Nintendo fired back by releasing the Super Nintendo. It was superior to the Genesis in almost every way, except for the speed of the CPU. Sega used this to their advantage by marketing that their console had blast processing while the SNES didn't. This was a bunch of marketing fluff, and blast processing doesn't actually mean diddles. Nintendo and Sega kept on pumping out game after game trying to one-up each other. The problem Sega ran into, however, was that they freaked out over specs and decided to release hardware add-ons to increase the power of the Genesis. These add-ons turned out to be the infamous Sega CD and Sega 32X. This made the Genesis seem weak in comparison to the Super Nintendo, as it felt like Sega had to overcompensate for the weak power of the Genesis. It didn't help that these two add-ons really didn't add much to the console other than a headache. Neither had a ton of standout titles and really just made it easier for Nintendo to fire back at Sega in advertisements. When Donkey Kong Country came out, Nintendo specifically highlighted the pre-rendered 3D graphics, as they said you wouldn't need a 32-bit or CD add-on for the game. In the end, while it was a tight race, the Super Nintendo beat out the Genesis, selling 49 million compared to 30 to 36 million. Different numbers are thrown around online. The major three-way war this time around was PlayStation versus Nintendo 64 versus Sega Saturn. Nintendo originally partnered with Sony to create a CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. However, after looking through their contract with Sony, Nintendo realized they would barely be making any money off of the software created for the add-on, as that would all go to Sony. Nintendo retaliated by partnering with Philips instead for the add-on that was never released, leaving Sony embarrassed and burned. Thus, Sony took the experience they accumulated while working on the SNES CD to create their own platform, the PlayStation. They were able to make an affordable CD-based game system with a good amount of titles to boot. When Nintendo revealed that the Nintendo 64 would use cartridges, that's when most third parties went to Sony, because a CD could hold so much more information than a cartridge. Nintendo classic franchises such as Castlevania, Mega Man, and Final Fantasy had their games mainly on PlayStation this generation. Sony garnered almost all of the third-party support, which on top of a good amount of quality first-party offerings, an aggressive marketing campaign, and an affordable price, allowed the PlayStation to dominate the 5th generation with over a staggering 100 million units sold. The Nintendo 64 came in a distant second with only around 32 million sold, and that leaves the Sega Saturn. Sega peeved off a ton of retailers by botching the launch of the Saturn, issuing a surprise launch, basically saying, "And the Saturn's in stores now," rather than giving enough prep time. Thus, some retailers flat out refused to carry the Saturn. The system was also difficult to develop for, and because of that, and the already low sales, lacked third-party support. I wonder who won this sucker. Dreamcast versus PlayStation 2 versus Xbox versus GameCube. The Dreamcast actually had a good launch and sold very well at the start, but momentum was murdered because of the impending launch of Sony's PlayStation 2. Think about it. Sony is making a sequel to the platform which sold over 100 million units. And this one played DVDs during a time in which DVD players were expensive and not very common to have. Now it came standard with this new game system. That's a no-brainer to buy. The PlayStation 2 absolutely slugged the Dreamcast into at least 4 different graves and dominated in sales compared to the Xbox and the GameCube. With the Xbox, that platform had a lot going for it in comparison to the PlayStation 2. Most multi-platform games actually looked better on the Xbox and had extra features. The system could play DVDs, though required a DVD remote accessory, but I think the main reason it failed to beat the PS2 was brand recognition. Nobody knew what the Xbox was, so it was more viable to go with the PlayStation 2. And Nintendo decided to focus on drooling instead of making educated business decisions and went with mini DVDs as the GameCube's disc format instead of actual DVDs. This meant not only the GameCube couldn't play movies, but also had a hard time fitting a fair amount of multi-platform games on a disc, so third-party support just wasn't as good as the PlayStation 2's or the Xbox's. Nintendo got relatively hungry for corporate flesh and decided to release the Wii, which focused not on horsepower, but a different way to play with the Wii remote. Some gamers were excited for the Wii, but it really struck a chord with the casual audience, or the normies. Stock was limited, so that added to the craze, making people buy the thing immediately if they saw it on store shelves, even if they didn't want it. Nintendo was sitting pretty this generation, but this momentum didn't last, and in the end, kinda hurt them as they made some dumb decisions with their next console. It's pretty obvious Nintendo won this generation, but how did the PS3 and Xbox 360 war turn out? Sony got way past smug with the PS3. After winning the past 2 generations, Sony believed they could make a ludicrously expensive console that's ridiculously difficult to develop for, and people would eat it up. I guess Sony thought by making PS3's architecture foreign, developers would spend all their time developing for their system so they wouldn't have time to develop for the Xbox 360 or the Wii. That obviously never happened. With an insane price and not a lot of great games, the PS3 failed to take off immediately, and people mainly went with the Xbox 360 instead. It was cheaper, had better online, and all the third-party support, with some first-party games like Halo. Most people were more than okay with going with the 360 instead of the PS3. However, this started to switch around near the middle of the gen. Sony flipped on their attitude, completely rebranding the PS3 with a new design that was leagues cheaper, and a new focus rather than media playback on the console, good games. Sony started pumping out game after game for the platform, and the PS3 garnered a stellar library by the end of its life. Microsoft started to focus on things like multimedia features and connect with the 360, and Sony just started to look better and better to some gamers. In the end, they were pretty neck and neck, both selling around 84 million units. And now we come to the current console race, PS4 versus Xbox One versus Wii U versus Nintendo Switch. The Wii U was announced first in 2011 and really didn't wow anybody over other than some Nintendo fans. At a less than stellar price point with little third-party support and a gimmick that just failed to capture anybody's attention, the Wii U failed, and it failed hard. Selling around 14 million units, it's pretty obvious why Nintendo released a new console this year. The PS4 has been the king of this generation so far, and it's pretty easy to see why. The Xbox One was absolutely creamed when it was announced due to all the bad press surrounding it. It can't play used games. It always requires to be online. It's $500. It looks like a VCR. It's really only a TV watching Call of Duty playing machine. Sony focused on games with the PS4's reveal and marketing, and when Sony revealed that the PS4 wouldn't be forcing online all the time, locking out used games, and would be cheaper than the launch price of the Xbox One, it was pretty much done right there. However, Microsoft has been doing a wonderful job spinning the story around on the Xbox One recently. They've been solely focusing on games nowadays, with things like backwards compatibility and Xbox Game Pass. The Xbox One S is a great piece of hardware that looks at least a solid 12 times better than the original Xbox One. The PS4 will win this generation in my opinion, but I think the Xbox One is doing enough right that it may be a close one when all is said and done. But what about the Nintendo Switch? I think it'll sell relatively well. It does have a purpose in this console race and has a major advantage compared to the Xbox One and PS4, that being portability. That is something the Wii U didn't have, and I think it's nice to have a console that's actually incredibly different from the norm. It shakes things up and keeps everything fresh. Will it outsell the PS4? No, but I think it and the other two consoles in this race will do well, and that's healthy for the industry.
Console wars are definitely one of the most interesting aspects of console generations. Sometimes the most powerful hardware wins, sometimes the most inept one does, and of course console wars encourage competition, which is good for the industry and us, the consumers. So it doesn't matter who wins this console generation, because we've gotten and will continue to get stellar titles from all of the big three. But don't take my word for it, that's why we're going to be looking at a reporter on the field, Reporty Jim, who is currently reporting on the console war grounds. How's it looking down there, Reporty Jim? I need to stop sending people to cover wars.